All right. Hello and welcome back to Alex's Daily Ground. But at the same time, I'm recording this live video, obviously, and recording my podcast at the same time. How cool is that? I mean, for those who want to see it, here's a live thing that's probably going to be available for, 24 hours, just in the story thing. And podcast, well, it goes to podcast. So just killing two birds with one stone. That's pretty cool. So I had a different topic in mind for today, but I just shot a video that was supposed to be a video on how to create requirements for your startup app. Instead, I figured out that we have 3 months of work ahead of us. And since I'm doing this Raising a Unicorn series, I figured out there's just a bunch of stuff that needs to be taken care of before we actually get to the requirements. And the requirements becomes part of it too, but I just made the list. I want to go over the list for those who are starting their startups, even for mature companies. You know, all this stuff needs to be taken care of. So I'm just going to go over this real quick. This is not going to be a long episode today because, these are just quick notes, but they're really important. So I started to work on the vision document. I completed the vision document, and I gave you the layout that I used for our newest startup. It's in one of the videos in the profile on my Instagram. But then I figured out that now we have to break down the vision to figure out what the MVP is really like. And the MVP stands for minimal viable product. So this is the first version of your application. This is what you go live with. And of course, it can't be that big, bold, wide, globe-wide application. I mean, it needs to have just the right amount of information, just the right amount of features to get the attention of your users, as well as provide enough value for them to stay with your app and to come back, so to retain them. So this is what I'm doing. This is what we have done already today. So we figured out what the MVP is. It's like maybe 20% of the vision that we had, and still pretty cool. It needs to be exciting. You can't really go with your full vision, and that's one of the common mistakes that, for example, we had a customer who was pushing to get everything he had in mind developed, and that was a huge mistake, obviously, because we spent 2 years developing something that, at the end became obsolete. It wasn't something that people wanted to see. I mean, he never did, the testing. He never did the alpha. He just basically believed in his product so much that, and he had the funds to basically see what it is. So he had enough funds to get that version he was dreaming about. But then it became so complicated, and the app itself became so complex that nobody could really understand what it was. And, it was never launched in the end of the day. And that's a very common theme, really. And that's one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of startups do make. What you have to do instead is to set yourself a deadline, I would say 3 to 6 months to build the product, build the first MVP, and release it. 3 to 6 months. That's your top deadline. Don't go over a year, 2 years, whatever. Even if you're spending your own money, especially if you're spending your own money, don't do that. Go 3 months to 6 months before you develop and release your first version of the MVP. That will give you enough space to then maneuver and maybe pivot and do something else. Okay. The second thing, after breaking down the vision and figuring out what the minimal viable product is, we're going to estimate the development effort, obviously. So now that we have 20% of the original wide vision, now we're going to estimate the development effort to understand how long is it actually going to take to develop this thing. That's an easy thing. It takes probably about 2 hours to basically understand how many man months it will take to develop the app, the backend, what kind of service we'll need if we need to use video, what kind of Amazon service we'll need for that. So that's a whole, routine for the development team to figure it out. Then the third thing is we need to get quotes from corporate attorneys who deal with startups on a daily basis and get the best price for C-Corp setup, terms, and investor contract preparations. This is why it's important. No investor will ever talk to you, obviously, if you don't have a C-Corp. And C-Corporation is the industry standard because it's the most common type of company that gets acquired. And investment is the most pleasant experience for the investor when it's a C-Corporation. The terms are important because you will have to have the terms for the users, you will have to have the terms for the investor, you will have to have the terms inside your stakeholder community, and the investor contract is important because if you're not going to invite your first investor, your seed round investor, or even Series A investor to be part of the board or become the stakeholder of the company, then you will have to keep your stakeholder community small, like, there are 3 of you, for example, or 4 of you, but then you issue those options to your investors. And that's when the contract comes to play, basically, which says that the investor gives you, $500,000, for example, for, equivalent of 10% of the company, but actually the investor is not buying the company or stake in the company. It's the equivalent. And, that's what's supposed to be the dividends later. Okay, number 4, once we have all the numbers, obviously we create the pitch deck. You need to know how long it's going to take and how much it's going to take to develop the product. You need to have quotes from the attorneys on how long and how much it's going to take to create the C-Corp for you, all the terms, investor contract, and all that stuff. Once you have all that, you're ready to work on your pitch deck. Once the pitch deck is ready, then we will go back to our investor and we'll pitch him one more time, even though all the details have already been discussed many times. But the pitch deck is the formal step, the final formal step before the investor gives you the final approval. And that's when you know everything has been done right. So the final approval on your pitch deck means that now you can actually go back to your attorneys and give them green light to form the company. And don't do it before that. I mean, the investor will ask you, do you have a company already? Sometimes it's good to have a company already, but it also doesn't really make much sense because you're already paying something and you don't have the yes from the investor yet. So I would go as lean as possible. If you're a startup, just you need to have all the numbers, obviously. You need to have the connections. You need to, have everyone on the standby. And once you get the yes from the investor, then you form the company. It takes like 1 day or something. And the next step is you sign the investor contract. So you would need to have a template, obviously, before the investor looks at your pitch deck. You would have to have all the terms that you want. So the negotiation happens once you talk your investor through the pitch deck. Then you negotiate. If the investor says yes, you negotiate the terms, and then you give the terms back to the attorneys. The company is formed, the contract is prepared, and the contract is signed. Usually it takes up to 2 weeks to complete all this stuff. After that, you do the pleasant part. You go and you open the bank account. It takes like 40 minutes. Once you create a bank account, then based on the investor contract, you go back to the investor, you give, all the details to his representatives, and that's when you receive your first installment. However you decide to do this, usually no investor would ever give you, like $2 million in one installment, for example, but, they will break them down based on your development plan, your marketing needs, and all that stuff. But sometimes, it could happen in just one payment, but most of the time it's not. So you will have a plan of your payments and you will receive your first installment. That's when you have the money to actually get the ball rolling. That's when you need to have your development team on standby. That's when you need to have your marketing team on standby, or, well, you might be the marketing team and you might be the development team yourselves. I'm not sure, how many people you have on your team, but in the typical setup, you would have those separate. And then you start development, obviously, because you need to have the product, right? And here's the tricky part about this. Obviously, if you're working with a contractor, you would have a separate contract for those guys. You would have to pay your attorneys again to prepare the contract. You need to be really wise and cautious about that stuff, because that's where the majority of the money will go, the initial phase, until you hit marketing. Marketing, obviously, usually takes a bigger chunk, but initially, development is where the money is going to. So you need to be really cautious about who you work with, why you work with them, what the track record is, how they can help you further. Are they do they understand the basics, like that you're building, a big product, and then the architecture needs to be built in from day one, even though you won't have enough features to support that architecture for the MVP. So there's a lot of details that I will do a separate video on, but that's really important. So once you start the development and development is on the way, that's when why I said this is a plan for 3 months, because basically if you give yourself 6 months till MVP, then somewhere around month 3 or 4, you need to start setting up meetings with the power users. That's what they're called, or influencers or whatever. When you have at least 30 to 50% of the product ready, and the MVP release date can be secured and is reliable. This is a very important step that a lot of startups really miss, and somehow they just neglect it and skip it. But this is the most important part, actually, because developing the product itself might be challenging and technically complicated, but it's not impossible. Like, anything can be built. What's more important is how you go about selling that thing, and how you start, how you market it. I mean, it's the easiest way is to just, get $5 million from round A investors, a seed round or whatever, and then just throw all that money at Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube marketing. But that's bullshit, because it really depends on your product, and you don't have to start with those crazy amounts. You need to test ground. You need to understand how your target audience responds. And in order to do that, the best way to do that is actually through influencer marketing. So that's when you need to know, okay, we need to find these kind of journalists, we need to find these kind of bloggers, this kind of influencers, Instagram influencers, and all that stuff, celebrities, whoever. So someone who can give you fast and targeted exposure. And you need to start setting up those meetings when at least 50% of the product is ready. That's when you will have some mock-ups already. That's when you will have a formulated idea of what it is. And when the MVP is going to be ready, that's where you tell those influencers, like, okay, this product's going to be ready in 3 months. We're giving you a sneak peek of what it's going to be now. So are you excited? And then you pay them, well, in most cases. Basically, after that's done, you will probably have like 10 to, I would start with 5 to 10 influencers per vertical. But it's better to start with one vertical, really, in one location. It's a lot more manageable than just going nationwide right away. I would not recommend going nationwide unless you have unlimited resources and you're like 100% or 1,000% sure that this idea is what the nation needs. But basically, go as lean as possible, because the cost of the first mistake might be so great that your MVP will go to shit, once it's released. The cost of the first mistake is really great. I mean, in today's world, especially, like if you get bad publicity, if you get bad reviews and feedback from early users, but you went nationwide and all that stuff is recorded and all that stuff is in App Store, I mean, fixing that, it will take you forever. So better start really, really, really lean, very local, very niche, so that you could fix stuff. I mean, we usually start like all the startups that we've been with, and what my company developed, and our own products, we always start with 2 to 3 influencers right away, and we develop really close relationships with them, and we ask them to provide us with 10 to 100 people. Just 100 people is tops. That's not even the alpha version. That's basically like pre-alpha, just to see how people even react to these colors, to these buttons, like how much time they're spending on this. And usually when you ask for, 10 to 100 people, you get the most dedicated people, because it's not like a wide release or not a big release. So people actually tend to help you because they understand that this is like a pre-alpha, so they need to give you candid feedback. If you tell them, hey, here's the product, go test it out, they will actually treat it as a final product, and they will give you, all the bullshit about it. But you don't need that at that point. At that point, you just need to see the patterns of usage and go as small as possible. Just go 10 to 100 people. It gives you enough data to work with. Just go with 3 to 5 to 10 maybe influencers. So initially, I would say pre-alpha, you would be working with 500 to 1,000 people. And that data is it's plenty, okay? Especially since you don't know how to handle that data, because all you have right now technically is a technical team that's developing your product. But now you need to find ways to process that data. And for that, you need to have separate people. You need to have all the graphs. You might ask your developers to create some scripts that will help you out with the data better. But again, you will be learning how to deal with your kind of data, because there are no out-of-the-box solutions or no standard ways of doing that. Basically, what you're looking for is patterns of usage, time, feedback from people. Actually, the best way is the old school way, basically contacting those 1,000 people. Split that between your team members, give everyone like 100 people or 200 people, 5 people a day or 10 people a day. Just go and interview those people. Understand what the real pattern of usage is. Don't just look at the numbers. The numbers won't tell you the story behind those numbers. So those 11 steps, let me list them again. Break down the vision to figure out what the MVP is really like. Estimate development effort for MVP. Get quotes from corporate attorneys who deal with startups, and get the best price for a C-Corporation setup, terms and investor contract preparations. Once you have all the numbers, create pitch deck, pitch your investor and get the final approval, form the company, sign the investor contract, open bank account, receive your first payment from the investor, start development, and set up meetings with power users when at least 50% of the product is ready and MVP release date is reliable. That's it. That will give you plenty of information and data to work with before your MVP is actually released, and you will be more than ready for that release, because at that moment when you have that 50% or 70% of the product ready, like 1 month before the MVP, you will already have plenty of data to work with. You will already know what works, what doesn't, or maybe you need to delay your release right now, or maybe you need to add more stuff to it, or maybe stuff that you hoped would work actually didn't find any response in your users' hearts. Who knows? I mean, that stuff is never predictable unless you're in B2B. Then it's that's a little simpler. And actually, a lot of venture capitalists, they prefer to work with B2B products because you can calculate a lot of the a lot of stuff can be really precise before you even release the product, because you get to talk to all those companies that you will be selling this to, and you can get like pre-orders and stuff. But if you're in a consumer application business, or if you're building an ecosystem or a platform that's supposed to grow and be big, and you are targeting consumer market, then that stuff is usually unpredictable. It requires very high level of trust and enthusiasm, both on your end and your investor's end. And if there's synergy there, then it's going to work. Thank you. I'm going to upload this now, and I'll see you tomorrow.